My name is Damian Fisher from the University of Kansas. Thank you for attending this virtual presentation for my talk entitled Das Man, Idle Talk, and Collective Deception. And in this, I'll be mostly concerned with three broad questions. What grounds collective deception in ordinary cyber discourse and social media groups? Are self-deception and collective deception interconnected? And what conditions help identify collective deception? And for this, I'll be focusing on Martin Heidegger's Ontology and Being and Time, specifically Das Man, or the they, and idle talk. And I'll be connecting this to Jennifer Lackey's work in group epistemology and deception. One motivation for this is that the literature I'm familiar with for collective deception tends to focus on highly specialized circumstances, such as if a company has been deceptive and how. And this seems to capture very well those circumstances, but doesn't seem to be general enough to map to ordinary cyber discourse in social media groups. Because of this, I've termed here general collective deception to capture that. And I've defined this as four conditions. So we can say for any group, a sufficient number of group members are collectively deceived, or that collective deception obtains if that sufficient number of group members have accessed truthful evidence. They possess the relevant epistemic tools to justifiably believe that truthful evidence. Here, epistemic tools means cognitive capabilities, educational levels, access to food, water, and shelter, access to free time, things of this sort, such that the likelihood and ability for someone to integrate that information or decide if it's true or false is much higher than it would otherwise be. And if these conditions have been met and the sufficient number of group members still assert or believe contrary to the truthful evidence, then I take this to be either for epistemic or non-epistemic reasons. The epistemic reason being a conflation of a weaker belief justification norm or a pragmatic norm as I've constructed it here. So insofar as when you're thirsty, you can go to the kitchen and get a glass of water. That only requires that you know that the success rate of that is pretty high. That's why you believe it. That's why you do it. Insofar as maybe having a higher belief justification norm for going to the kitchen sink would require a non-pragmatic justification. So you know how wastewater management works and how the plumbing in your house works, such that that's faster than going and getting water somewhere else. Maybe that's why you do that. That would be a stronger belief justification norm. I take truthful evidence to meet the stronger belief justification norm, and our everyday going abouts in the world to tend to meet only a weaker belief justification norm, or the pragmatic one. Insofar as that sufficient number of group members believes against the evidence for non-epistemic reasons, I take this to be because of psychological motivation. So maybe asserting the truth is riskier. Maybe they want to be a part of an identity group that they're affiliated with, and that identity group doesn't believe the truthful evidence. This would be an example of non-epistemically justifying a certain belief. So to ground collective deception and explain how self-deception and collective deception are interconnected, I argue that Heidegger's Das Man, or the they, and idle talk are the grounds for collective deception. And insofar as they're part of our being or our ontology, these then explain the interconnection between self-deception and collective deception. So for Heidegger, beings such as ourselves, Dasein, we have Dasein, Dasein is distinct from chairs and theories, and Dasein has distinct structural components to its ontology. It's always in a world, it's always with others, it has the they in language, and idle talk, being a part of language, is then a part of our ontology. And the they has 5 characteristics. The first one is that it's always with us. We always are interpreting the world, understanding the world in relation to the they and others. And it's indefinite insofar as there is no representation of the they that we can point to. It's not grounded in the summation of a set of Dasein or a universal subject over and above any group. This would be another way to put this would be saying that the they is neither reductively understood nor inflationarily understood. The realm of the they is publicness, and this establishes a normativity. And we can see this insofar as if you're at your home and the blinds are drawn, it's unlikely that you will be acting in ways that don't assume that someone could see or can see you. And insofar as this is a normative or averageness that we all are acting towards, we're motivated to continually meet this averageness. Another way of putting this is that it's easier to be average than it is to be extraordinary. And we're psychologically motivated to conform insofar as it's easier to just meet that averageness. The they is groundless, and this is in part because of idle talk. So idle talk is the language of the they, and it promotes groundless acquisition and communication of information. So at a certain point of proliferation of idle talk, the they becomes a faceless mass or authority that we can point to justify things through idle talk. One mode of idle talk is to assert a belief that you may or may not actually have without actually even being able to justify that belief. So if you say all Californians surf, and you only believe that because you think that is what goes on in California, this would be a form of idle talk. And we can see idle talk whenever we ask for further justifications, and those justifications find appeals to authority or to what it means to be a Californian. This type of belief justification would be a sign or symptom of idle talk. I take idle talk to also be an example of Jennifer Lackey's selfless assertions. So selfless assertions occur when, say, a biology teacher who's a creationist teaches evolutionary theory to be true, but for non-epistemic reasons, the biology teacher is actually asserting something they don't believe. And this could be from the psychological motivation to keep a job or to be in the in-group that they identify with, namely creationists. Insofar as idle talk in the they are parts of all Dasein, and Dasein ultimately make up groups, we can say that the they and idle talk ground collective deception and explain how self-deception and collective deception are interconnected. And this leads to identifying signs of collective deception. So for general collective deception, I take a more general, robust sense of deception to be sufficient to explore that phenomenon. And here I outline 3 conditions that are either sufficient to say that collective deception obtains, or they dramatically increase the probability that collective deception will obtain. The first condition is just generalized deception. So assertions that are just of a very generalized deception type occur with or without intention in some context, and they occur from concealing pertinent or relevant information from another person or group of people. And these occur readily in cyber discourse insofar as cyber discourse is decontextualized usually, or it passes along a lot of decontextualized information as if it is truthful or factual. And this is connected to the second condition for robust deception, namely misleading assertions. So misleading assertions occur when a person asserts something or believes in something, but they either can't justify that belief, or in sharing it, they don't realize that they're being misleading because they overestimate the epistemic tools of their audience. And this also seems to occur very readily in cyber discourse and in social media groups, whether they're centralized and curated, such as Instagram followers, Facebook friends, or if they're decentralized and maximally inclusive, such as chat rooms, Reddit, blog spots, etc. And an example of this occurring, we could imagine a physicist discussing the standard model of physics on Zoom, and it's public facing. They've been invited to do this. And maybe they nonchalantly mention that the standard model of physics doesn't account for gravity. And from this, a member of the audience either believes that gravity isn't real or that the standard model of physics isn't truthful. And though this isn't the intention of the physicist in this moment, the physicist is unlikely to be able to counteract this misled belief, if you will, either because the chat room is overflowing with questions or the inability for that person to ask their question, to get clarification on it, the inability for the physicist to read the body language of that person such that they are unaware that that person even is questioning the strengths of the standard model of physics. And this then would be a example of misleading assertions. Likewise, insofar as that person carried that belief onwards and shared it, this would be an example of idle talk. And we can imagine a sufficient number of people eventually being able to appeal to a faceless mass, for this faceless physicist who asserts this even though they don't. And this would be an example of the they. And this leads to the third condition, namely Gish-Galloping assertions. And Gish-Galloping assertions are positive and negative, and they're generalized to account for fire hosing and other forms of propaganda. Fire hosing here is just overwhelming an opponent with lies or misinformation, disinformation, so that that opponent or person believes a false belief rather than truthful evidence. And I've outlined Gish-Galloping assertions generally to be in some context when someone intends to inform or mislead, they overload that person or a group of people with relevant or non-relevant information about whatever belief they're discussing. And this is to raise the probability of that person or group of people coming to hold the belief that they desire. So one form of negative fire hosing would be the proliferation of fake news, lies, disinformation, misinformation to overwhelm anyone being able to reasonably counter all of that. And this creates a sense of a mass or a faceless mass, such as the they, wherein one can appeal to this group, the they, for justification in believing counter to any truthful evidence they may come across. This is intentional insofar as the person has a vested interest in the outcome of the belief, which makes it distinct from Henry Frankfurt's conception of bullshit, where bullshit and the bullshitter don't care about the rules of reasoning or justified belief. They're just partaking in this act. A positive version of fire hosing would be the overloading of, say, students from an excited professor. Maybe the professor overestimates the epistemic tools that the students have access to or have at that time. Maybe they go off on a tangent and they get into the weeds with some of the research, and maybe some of that research is contested. But insofar as the students are unable to parse through this sufficiently, this would be deceptive and increases the likelihood of students getting either false beliefs or incorrect inferences from that information. And the professor, assumingly, is not doing this intentionally or maliciously, yet is ultimately creating a deceptive environment. And if students go on to carry that belief and share it with others, then again, if at a certain point there's a faceless mass or a faceless professor that another person can appeal to and say that they believe this, so I can believe this, that would be a form of idle talk and appeal to the they, especially given the professor is unlikely to actually believe that false inference or false conclusion from what they're saying. In conclusion, I take, if my argument holds thus far, I take it to be the case that robust deception better identifies deceptive practices in ordinary cyber discourse and social media groups, and it allows us to better engage with what may be deceptive in our day-to-day lives, curbing misinformation and disinformation or fake news in cyber discourse and ordinary social media groups in relation to the conditions I've outlined would then help provide a general framework for minimizing the probability of collective deception and minimizing the proliferation and rise of malicious and deceptive objects or radical and deceptive approaches and theories to the world. Thank you again for your time.